We will be looking at 4 types of tissue altogether, and those are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. Let's start with epithelial tissue. In short, this is tissue that covers things, including our entire body. The outer layer of our skin is made of epithelial tissue. This tissue also dips into body cavities, covering the digestive and respiratory systems, and it even lines blood vessels and various organs. All of this can be considered covering and lining epithelium, which act as boundaries, and any substance that enters or exits the body must pass through some kind of epithelium. There is also glandular epithelium, which makes up all the glands in the body, and we will discuss those in more detail a little later. For now, let's just describe the key features of epithelial tissue. First, since we are talking about cells that line the exterior of the body or a cavity, then we should distinguish between the apical surface, or the surface exposed to the exterior, and the basal surface, which is attached to some connective tissue within, and the rest of the organism. The apical surface is sometimes smooth, but it is often lined with microvilli, which are tiny projections of the plasma membrane meant to maximize the exposed surface area. Because the two opposite sides of the cell have different features, we say that epithelial cells exhibit polarity. These features also exhibit different functionality. Microvilli enhance certain cells' ability to either secrete or absorb substances, while other cells may have cilia lining the apical surface, which are hair-like structures that propel substances along. On the other side, the basal surface of these cells are attached to something called the basal lamina, which is not made of cells, but rather glycoproteins and collagen fibers, which act as a kind of scaffolding. This is adjacent to the reticular lamina, and these two components together form the basement membrane. Supported by this basement membrane, epithelial cells will typically be found in sheets right up next to each other. They are often bound together by desmosomes, which connect adjacent cells with filaments. Depending on the specific function of the tissue, there can also be tight junctions, which block the flow of fluids between cells, and gap junctions, which are pores that connect adjacent cells, allowing for communication via the transmission of ions that can carry electric current. Next, we should be aware that epithelial tissues are avascular, which means there are no blood vessels, but they are innervated, which means they are supplied with nerves. We will learn much more about blood vessels and nerves later in the series. And lastly, epithelial cells regenerate very quickly by necessity because given their position at the boundary between some component of the body and the exterior, there is the potential for significant friction or even injury. So these are the features of epithelial tissue, which allow it to perform a variety of functions, including protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, and sensory reception. Now let's discuss further classification of epithelial cells, as they vary in the number of layers present in a tissue, as well as the specific shape of each cell. First, there can be simple epithelia, which means a single layer of cells. Or there can be stratified epithelia, which means there are 2 or more layers of cells stacked on top of each other. Then, in terms of shape, each cell typically has a hexagonal base, which allows for close packing, but the height of each cell can differ. Squamous cells are very flat, kind of like scales. Cuboidal cells are boxy, of medium height. And columnar cells are very tall, like columns. Putting these two characteristics together, we will need one word to indicate the number of layers in the epithelium and another word to indicate the shape of each cell in the epithelium. So for example, we can have a simple squamous epithelium, a single layer of flat cells with disc-shaped nuclei. This looks kind of like a tiled floor, and this structure is ideal when rapid exchange of materials by diffusion is important. Two types of simple squamous epithelia are endothelium and mesothelium, which differ in their location in the body, and we will talk more about these later. Next, we have simple cuboidal epithelium, a single sheet with boxy cells, perfect for secretion and absorption. Rounding out the simple epithelia, we have simple columnar epithelium, a single layer of very tall cells. These are also ideal for secretion and absorption, particularly in the context of digestion. Now, before moving on to stratified epithelia, we should mention pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, which is like simple columnar epithelium, but the nuclei are staggered in their positioning, and sometimes the cells are of varying heights, with some not reaching the apical surface. This gives it the appearance of being stratified, hence the name. Now let's move on to stratified squamous epithelium, which is several layers of thin cells. This is extremely common and perfect for protection, which is why the outermost part of our skin has this composition. The cells at the surface are squamous, able to quickly regenerate if rubbed away. But as we go deeper, the cells actually become cuboidal or even columnar. Much more rare are stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar epithelia, where all the layers have cells of these other shapes. But they are found in a few locations, like certain types of glands. Lastly, there is also transitional epithelium, which is able to stretch and change shape to accommodate a cavity being filled with liquid. And this will be discussed when we look at the urinary system. Before moving on, we must mention glandular epithelia. These are different from the types we have just mentioned, and they are found in glands, which are collections of one or more cells whose purpose is to generate and secrete specific substances, often signaling molecules like hormones. These glands can be exocrine glands, which produce and secrete substances through a duct onto an epithelial surface, or endocrine glands, which secrete their products directly into the blood. We will talk about the endocrine system later in the series, as well as a variety of exocrine glands as they become relevant. The four main kinds of connective tissue are connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. A few of these may not seem like they would have qualified as tissue, so we must be aware that connective tissue does much more than just connect the body parts. Its functions include binding, support, protection, insulation, storage, and transportation of substances throughout the body. While these are rather disparate purposes, there are some things that all connective tissue has in common. They are all derived from a particular type of embryonic tissue called mesenchyme, and they are comprised not just of cells, but also of an extensive extracellular matrix. This matrix is what makes this type of tissue so good at withstanding lots of force or tension. Let's go over the main components of connective tissue now. Connective tissues are comprised of ground substance, fibers, and cells. And the first two of these components are what make up the extracellular matrix that we mentioned. Let's start with ground substance. This is the material that fills the space between the cells and connects all the fibers. It's made up of interstitial fluid, cell adhesion proteins, and proteoglycans, which to varying degrees act as a sort of glue. Embedded within the ground substance are the fibers, as we mentioned, and these come in a few varieties. Collagen fibers are the strongest, made predominantly of the protein collagen, as one might guess, which is the most abundant protein in the body. These proteins are assembled into cross-linked fibrils and then bundled together to form fibers. Gram for gram, these fibers are stronger than steel and prevent things from being pulled apart. Then there are elastic fibers. These are long and thin, made of a stretchy protein called elastin, and they form networks within the extracellular matrix. Lastly, there are reticular fibers. These are similar to collagen fibers, but they form networks supporting other types of tissue. With ground substance and fibers covered, that leaves us with the cells. These can be any of the varieties we listed earlier, and they can either be mature or immature, the latter meaning they have not yet differentiated or specialized. In this actively mitotic state, they will secrete the ground substance and fibers characteristic of the cell type they will become, and these have different names from the mature cells, ending in the suffix blast, which means they are forming. Connective tissue proper forms from fibroblasts. Cartilage comes from chondroblasts, and bones from osteoblasts. Blood cells come from hematopoietic stem cells, but as this is a different process, we will examine this when we take a closer look at the bloodstream. Once mature, the suffix blast becomes another suffix, cyte, leaving us with fibrocytes, chondrocytes, and osteocytes, among other types as well, such as fat cells and some others we will discuss later. Now that we have some general information down, let's look at each type of connective tissue a little more closely. First, connective tissue proper. This can be either loose connective tissue or dense connective tissue. These categories each have 3 subcategories as well. Loose connective tissue can be areolar, adipose, or reticular. The areolar variety has lots of fibers that support and bind other tissues, with lots of empty space for storing tissue fluid. This is the most abundant connective tissue, wrapping around some structures and cushioning others. Adipose connective tissue consists of fat cells, which store nutrients and insulate the body. And reticular connective tissue is similar to areolar, but with only reticular fibers, supporting certain structures in the body. Now looking at dense connective tissue, this can be regular, irregular, or elastic. Regular variety is basically a bunch of collagen fibers packed together, with fibroblasts nestled in between, and this can resist a lot of tension, thus forming tendons and ligaments, which we will discuss later. The irregular type also has lots of collagen fibers, but they are not arranged in such an organized manner, offering resistance to tension in many directions. Lastly, elastic connective tissue is similar to the dense regular variety, but more elastic, as one might guess. So that covers connective tissue proper. Now let's look at cartilage. This has similarities with connective tissue proper because it too withstands tension, but it can also withstand compression. This makes it sort of an intermediate between dense connective tissue and bone. Cartilage lacks both nerve cells and blood vessels, so it receives nutrients by diffusion from blood vessels in a nearby connective tissue membrane. Cartilage also contains a lot of tissue fluid, which assists in withstanding compression. There are 3 types to be aware of. Those are hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. The first, hyaline, is the most abundant. It is amorphous but firm, and thus good at reinforcing and cushioning structures. Elastic cartilage is similar, but has more elastic fibers in its matrix. This is the stuff in your ear. And then fibrocartilage is sort of in between dense connective tissue and hyaline cartilage, with rows of chondrocytes alternating with rows of collagen fibers, making it compressible but still great at withstanding tension. This is found in discs that separate the vertebrae of the spine. Next, let's take a look at bone. As we know, bone or osseous tissue is much harder than cartilage or connective tissue proper. The matrix of bone is similar to cartilage in that there is lots of collagen, but there are also inorganic calcium salts, and that's the component that makes bone so hard. Another difference is that unlike cartilage, bone does contain blood vessels. Speaking of blood, which is the fluid found in blood vessels, this is also the fourth type of connective tissue. It seems counterintuitive because it doesn't connect or support anything, but we call blood a connective tissue because it develops from mesenchyme, and blood cells are surrounded by a non-living fluid matrix called blood plasma. Since blood is so different from the other types of connective tissue we have just discussed, we will hold off on describing blood until we investigate the circulatory system. There are two more types of tissue, those being muscle tissue and nervous tissue, but we will delve into those when we discuss the muscular system and the nervous system.